Happy Wednesday, everybody. Today I'm going to finally talk about rotation and what to expect come July 30th when we get Bloomborough and we say goodbye to Midnight Hunt, Crimson Vow, Neon Dynasty, and Streets of New Capenna. So we're going to be covering all of these decks and what I think will happen post-rotation and just kind of give you my thoughts in general. First, I'd like to talk about Mono Red Aggro. Just going to kind of go down the list according to MTG Goldfish as far as popularity in the best of 3 tournament scene. There is always going to be a little bit of a difference between how best of 3 is affected and best of 1. For example, Celestia Enchantments is basically non-existent in the best of 3 meta, but is going to be completely destroyed after rotation because it's based off of all of the Neon Dynasty cards. So I'm largely going to keep this focused to best of 3, but I will talk about how it will affect best of 1 where applicable. So first up here, what I've done is I have taken some of the recent tournament winners in the Standard Challenge on Magic the Gathering Online and pulled out all of the cards that are from the 4 sets that are rotating out. So what we're going to see from Mono Red Aggro, and this is different than the Mono Red Prowess that we're going to see in Best of 1, which is going to be more relevant to the conversation in Gruul Aggro, which we'll cover later. But the biggest hit to Mono Red Aggro is losing Kumano Faces Kakazan. It has several effects, so it's good for the Prowess space, being a non-creature. The fact that it deals 1 damage to planeswalkers is relevant a lot of the time. Being able to give a creature +1/+1 on your 2-drop, and then it beating a 2/2 haste on turn 3, as well as the effect of making creatures exiled when they die, has been quite a powerful 1-drop. Basically an automatic include in a lot of mono red decks. So it's going to hurt to lose Kumano Faces Kakazan, but I don't think it's going to be the end of the archetype as we know it. I think there's some interesting 1-drops that could replace it to an extent. Usually we see Phoenix Chicks kind of being lowered in best of 3. I think we'll see a full playset of Phoenix Chick post-rotation, just because I think it's one of your better 1-drops. An alternative, though, is the Frantic Scapegoat, being able to make one of your 2-drops then a evasive threat, as well as just being a Raging Goblin. I think might be something worth exploring. So that would be my solution, is to bring out the 4 Kumanos, bring in 2 Phoenix Chicks, and bring in 2 Frantic Scapegoats. The other card that we're losing that's going to hurt the mono red archetype, especially in best of 3, where it's a little bit slower, is Bloodthirsty Adversary. A lot of times we see this get replaced in best of 1, but in best of 3, it usually is it's considered part of the core of the deck. So Bloodthirsty Adversary is also going to hurt a little bit, but we do have 2-drop options, so we can replace it with 2 more copies of the Charming Scoundrel, as well as 2 more copies of the Feldon Ronom Excavator. Alternatively, Mono Red and Mono Red Prowess may start to blend even in the best of 3 meta, and we may see Slickshot Show Off make it into the mono red aggro core. So that could be an alternative, is instead of upping these by 2, we could bring in a full playset of Slickshot Show Off. Now, generally, you see Slickshot Show Off performing worse in best of 3 than you do in best of 1, because it is easier to sideboard in single point interaction to then deal with the Slickshot Show Off, which is why I think it'll be primarily kept to the Gruul space, where you can then protect it with Snakeskin Veil. The other one that we're losing is Play with Fire. So we're going to lose 4 copies of Play with Fire. This one is pretty easy to replace with Shock. The downside is that we won't get the Scry if we are shooting them in the face. So, but it still largely does the same thing. It's able to shoot 2 toughness creatures at instant speed. It triggers Prowess. So I think a lot of times Play with Fire will just be traded out 1-for-1 with Shock. And then the other one that we're losing is Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance. It is not necessary, it's not a core part of the strategy, and can easily just be replaced with a Mountain. Next up on the list is Orzhov Midrange, very similar to the Esper Midrange space, but not running Dinnik and Rafine and just keeping it strictly to black and white. I do not believe that this archetype is going to survive rotation because of largely because of the Wandering Emperor and the Wedding Announcement just having very few good replacement cards for what they're offering in the deck. So Graveyard Trespasser could be replaced with Preacher of the Schism, and Tenacious Underdog could be replaced with I was going to say Caustic Bronco, but there's already 4 there. So the nice thing about the Tenacious Underdog is that it gives you this recurring threat that can be hard for Control to deal with outside of exile, right? So this one is also going to be somewhat difficult to replace. But the Wedding Announcement and the Wandering Emperor is largely why we're playing white. So if we're getting rid of the Wedding Announcement and the Wandering Emperor, this core of the deck can still find alternatives to replace it. The issue then is that the only white card that we're really interested in playing is the Virtue of Loyalty. And without the go wide of Wedding Announcement, although you could get some off of the Preacher of the Schism, isn't really offering you that much of a space to justify being like, why are you in this as opposed to Golgari or as opposed to Dimir? So we're going to see a lot of, like, black is here to stay and is definitely getting better post-rotation. I just don't think that this version of Orzhov Midrange built off of the token synergies is going to be surviving rotation. I do think there's going to be an Orzhov aggro deck that shows up, but I'm going to save that for talking about it post-rotation once we have a little bit better idea of what cards come from Bloomburrow and what the meta looks like. Yeah, and then the lands would be doable enough. Like I said, I don't think the Orzhov space is going to be like dead as far as the lands go. So we will be able to find replacements for some of this, and there is something interesting to be said about this space, as we'll get into when I talk about Golgari. Next up on the list is Boros Convoke, and I think Boros Convoke is really well positioned. It's one of the top meta decks before rotation, and after rotation we're not losing that much. So the thing that's going to hurt the most is the Voldaren Epicure. Being able to have that 1-drop that then gives us the blood token that we can hit with the Gleeful Demolition does help set up the turn 2 Knight Errant Eos play. Now, there is, we can play the 4 copies of the Ocean Frontliner. This one is often a tech card that comes in over the Lunarch Veteran, which we are losing the Lunarch Veteran. But a full playset of the Frontliner would allow us to still have a Gleeful Demolition target. It would make the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos a little bit harder to pull off, but still theoretically possible. The lands, the Gonjo and the Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance are easy enough to replace with just the basics, and then Sundown Pass isn't huge that we're losing this. I do think we can just get away with running like an additional Cavern of Souls or maybe a Myrix, and then largely the deck is going to stay the same. Now, this list that I pulled for this one had 1 copy of the Ocean Frontliner in already, so I've just decided to up the one additional copy of the Get Lost. Now, there's a couple of different things too about like how the deck will eventually pan out. Like, are we going to run the Sanguine Evangelist and the Nurturing Pixie, which works better with the Sanguine Evangelist than the War Leader's Call, or are we going to see the War Leader's Call stay in the main? That's all stuff that we'll have to address post-rotation, just depending on how the meta pans out, because as we'll get here, Azorius Control is not looking particularly good, and War Leader's Call is better against the control space. Another list that I think is looking pretty good post-rotation is the Dimir Midrange or Dimir Aggro lists. And this one, the thing that's going to hurt it the most is losing Make Disappear. Being able to basically hit them for do a quench ×2, make them pay 4 colorless to counterspell something if you do the casualty, was something that this deck definitely was interested in doing, since we don't really care about our Spyglass Sirens and or the tokens off of Preacher of the Schism. It was pretty easy to get the casualty 1 paid off. We could play either the Phantom Interference that can create a 2/2 flying token that's a quench, or we could play the Reasonable Doubt, which is a quench that then can also suspect 1 target creature. So if you suspect your opponent's creature, it can't block. So this can be kind of somewhat of quasi removal, which I think makes it really interesting in the tempo space and a pretty good alternative to explore instead of Make Disappear. So I chose to go with the Reasonable Doubt over the Phantom Interference. The other thing that we're losing is the Ottawara and the Takanuma. Again, these Neon Dynasty legendary lands can just be replaced with the basics. So I just replaced this with one island and replaced this with one swamp. And then Shipwreck Marsh is a little bit trickier to figure out how we're going to replace the slow lands that we had from Midnight Hunt. And I think that Cavern of Souls is going to work pretty well in this deck, especially because the majority creature types are fairy, and fairy with the fairy mastermind, and the Phyrexians. So we've got the Gix and Urtai and Shieldred are all Phyrexians. So it's a little bit thin because, like, you know, this is a pirate, this is a vampire. It's not 100% going to be as great as the Shipwreck Marsh, but should be able to get the deck into a functional space. Next up, I'd like to talk about Domain, and Domain is not going to survive rotation. We're losing the Topiary Stomper, which isn't huge. We can make the ramp work without the Topiary Stomper. The depopulates too could be, you know, other wraths. But the thing that's really going to hurt the 3-color space is the Triomes. So we have seen them reprint the Triomes from 2020 in Ikoria, in Streets of New Capenna in 2022. So if they are going to start reprinting Triomes every 2 years or something like that, we may see a replacement for the Triomes that we're going to lose from Streets of New Capenna. If that happens, then Domain can still be a viable space, but until that happens, it's going to go away until those are replaced. Next up, I'd like to talk about Golgari Midrange, and so Golgari Midrange was competitive for a moment, and then Domain was a really big problem for the Golgari Midrange deck. And so with Domain not being a viable option post-rotation, at least without some major changes or potentially running a leyline or something like that, Golgari Midrange is well positioned because its biggest weakness is leaving the meta, right? So I think we're going to see a rise in the Golgari Midrange, or the Rock as it used to be called, and we do see some changes that we'll have to undergo for the archetype. So we are losing the Graveyard Trespasser, as I mentioned. I do think that the Preacher of the Schism is a relatively decent inclusion, especially because the Temur Landfall deck is also leaving. So so same with the 4-color or 5-color Legends deck, as we'll cover. So the Graveyard Hate isn't going to be as necessary as it is in the current pre-rotation meta. So I think that, you know, Preacher plays pretty well in the black space, the Death Touch, etc. You know, good blocker, gives you additional card draw, really fits into just the value of what Golgari Midrange is trying to do. Sorin the Mirthless is going away. This wasn't really considered part of the core of the deck. It was included sometimes, but definitely not necessary. I think we could just run an additional copy of Liliana of the Veil and be totally fine. We're also losing Takanuma and Boseiju. Again, those can just be replaced by a swamp and 2 forests. And then the Deathcap Glade is another one that's going to be kind of sad. So in Crimson Vow, we also had the other set of slow lands, and so this was going to be a little bit harder to replace. We do have either Cavern of Souls or Mirrex, and the problem with Mirrex is you get that, like, color source for 1 turn, and then it becomes a colorless land. And then Cavern of Souls is kind of in the same boat, where it can give you a color if you name the right creature type. Otherwise, it's a colorless card. So it's we're going to be a little bit sad to see the Midnight Hunt and the Crimson Vow in the 2-color space, but I still think it's going to be viable either with Cavern of Souls or Mirrex. To be able to cast our double pip black cards really is going to be the harder part of getting this deck to work, but I still think it's a very viable option and looks well positioned post rotation. And again, some of this is not considered core, just the current Golgari winner of the last standard challenge was exploring running Analyze the Pollen and Pillage the Bog, so I didn't change any of the stuff that wasn't rotating out. Just to be totally clear, the final form of this may not be running Harvester of Misery, for example, but we'll talk about that post-rotation when we have the first set of tournament winners. Next up, I'd like to talk about Azorius Control, and Azorius Control is getting hurt by rotation for sure. So we're losing the March of the Otherworldly Light, which really helps against the Boros Convoke and preventing the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos. We're losing Depopulate and Farewell, which isn't a big deal. They could be Sunfalls. The big tools that we're losing in the deck that I think are impossible to replace are the Wandering Emperor and Memory Deluge. You could do something like Impulse or Moment of Truth to give you some dig, but it's just not going to be the same since Memory Deluge was putting 2 cards into your hand and then also had the flashback, where Control really needs that some sort of card advantage to be able to answer your opponent's stuff 1 for 1 and then eventually win, right? The other thing too is Wandering Emperor was not only removal, but it was also a win condition. You could eventually overrun your opponent by creating the 2/2 Samurai creature tokens, and it's going to be very difficult to replace. You could try running like multiple copies of Jace and maybe bringing in the Teresian Mindbreaker and going strictly for a mill strategy. But again, your biggest thing that's going to hurt you the most is there's just really no good replacement for Memory Deluge. As far as like this, Field of Ruin is here to stay, so you could just run the other version of Field of Ruin. The Deserted Beaches, again, are going to be another one that's kind of hard. I think you could just run additional Dark Arc Wastes and Seachrome Coasts if you wanted to get it to work, and then the Ganjo and the Otawara could just be basics. So it's close. It's close to still being a viable archetype, but you've got to come up with some sort of solution for what we're going to do with losing Memory Deluge. All right, next up I want to talk about Gruul Aggro, and as far as the best of 3 space goes, this is kind of the mono-red prowess that you're going to see in best of 1, right? So it is a viable archetype in best of 3, largely because you can then have an answer to your opponent sideboarding in more removal for the Slickshot Show-Off, and then you also have the card advantage of questing Druid. So this is definitely going to be hurt again, similar to the mono-red aggro archetype, by the removal or the loss of Kumano Faces Kakazan. There's no great replacement for this card, but again, I think just some form of aggressive 1-drop is probably the best that we can do. And Cacophony Scamp, I think, works relatively well with the Monstrous Rage and just the general double strike theme that Gruul Aggro is trying to do. So we could replace the Kumanos with Cacophony Scamp. It is going to hurt a little bit, but I still think it's going to be viable. Similar to Mono Red Aggro, I think we can replace the Play with Fires with the 4 copies of Shock, and then the 2 Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance we can just replace with Mountains. So Esper Midrange, similar to the Orzhov Midrange space, is unlikely to survive because there's just no replacement for Rafine's Scheming Seer. Dinnick Pious Apprentice is also going to hurt the archetype because this was a nice stabilization against the early aggro decks. And then, of course, Wandering Emperor is going to hurt losing this. We're also going to lose the Rafine's Tower, which helps fix for the 3-color space, as well as the Slowlands from Crimson Vow. So it would be difficult to get this archetype to work, and I think we're going to see a shift away from the Orzhov Midrange and Esper Midrange that we've seen a lot of, and like I mentioned, I think Orzhov is going to be probably the closest version of this, or Dimir Aggro. They're going to kind of split into 2, and then Orzhov I think is going to take a more aggressive line, probably with the Bone Brutes and some sort of thing like that. Similar to Dimir Aggro, going into more of an aggro direction is how I see it happening post-rotation. And I'd also like to talk about Temur Control. Oop. This is how you filter it out, by the way, is you do set, and then you do set or, and then or. You can list them all out so that you can see all of the cards that are going away during rotation. But this is another archetype that's not going to survive. It's not really desperately needing the Memory Deluge, although it certainly helps. It's not as critical to this archetype as it is in Azorius Control. And then Shigeki and Colossal Sky Turtle are not core to the deck either. The biggest thing that's going to hit, though, is the Streets of New Capenna lands. The Sacrifice lands were critical to getting the Aftermath Analyst loop to give you the life and the additional, core of how you trigger that many landfalls. So without some sort of sacrifice land that was able to do the loop, then this deck is no longer viable. And Temur Control was largely why we saw Domain go away, right? So there was this little bit of this rock, paper, scissors in best of 3, where Golgari Midrange was beaten out by Domain, and then Domain was beaten out by Temur Control. And so we're definitely going to see a shift in just the general rock, paper, scissors of the best of 3 meta. But again, that's something that we'll cover after the rotation happens. I'd also like to talk a little bit about Bant Poison, and this was another one that was a good answer to Domain, especially, I think. The Fading Hope is going away, and that one's going to be difficult to replace, but the one that is really key to getting this archetype, and the reason why it's in Bant as opposed to Celestia, is because of March of Swirling Mist. Being able to use March of Swirling Mist to then one turn kill your opponent with a Venerated Rot Priest or two is a core part of this deck, and there's no easy replacement for the March of the Swirling Mist that can target multiple cards of your own, especially with the ability to make it cost less by discarding cards from your hand. So largely what we're going to see is, I think, a shift either towards Dimir Poison or Celestia Poison. And again, that's one I'm going to hold off on talking about until we actually get into Bloomburrow. Because I do think that the version that's running the Slaughter Singer and the Bloated Contaminator has been kind of lurking in the shadows and may make an appearance, but I don't really want to like say that that's the direction that it's going to go until I feel a little bit more certain. And I'd also like to talk about the 4-color or 5 colors legend space. This is not something that you see very often in Best of 1, but was a very popular deck in the high levels of competition, like in the Pro Tour, centered largely around Slogurk the Overslime. Sorry, I forgot to set it up separately. And we're starting to... I will hopefully fix this orange glitch thing here soon. But not only are we losing Slogurk the Overslime, which was kind of a core piece of the deck, we're also losing the Streets of New Capenna, which helps fix for the 3-color space, and then most critically, we're losing the legendary lands, which were part of the recycling of what this deck was trying to do to get additional value off of the lands that it was playing. So this archetype is also not going to survive rotation. And last but not least, I would like to talk about Simic Cookies, or Simic Artifacts. And this one is surprisingly not a very popular pick, despite it doing quite well. Like, a lot of the... it has had really great stats, especially on the ladder in Best of 3 on Arena. Not necessarily the tournament scene, but I feel like people are sleeping a little bit on Simic Artifacts, and post-rotation, I think it's definitely going to be a tier 1 top performer, just because like it's already performing well enough. Its weakest spot is definitely Boros Convoke, but since Boros Convoke is getting hit down a little bit in power, it's possible that will help this archetype, if anything. The only thing that this list is losing are the Neon Dynasty legendary lands, which can be replaced with basics. So nothing else. Just put in an island, put in a forest, you're good to go. So the flex spot here with the Lava Spur Boots is largely the spot that like changes the most. Sometimes we see this like being the GT. I explored it at least being the GT. This is a spot that will probably change over time, but for now, that's what's looking like a good one to explore is the Lava Spur Boots. So I hope that gives you an idea of how rotation is affecting the best of 3 meta and how that will trickle down into best of 1. I didn't talk about like Celestia Enchantments, which is the best of 1 deck that's going away. I didn't really talk about Mono White Humans, which is a best of 1 deck that's largely going away. There will be some implications down the line for best of 1, but largely what we see in best of 3 trickles down into best of 1 over time. And the other thing, too, that I didn't really talk about is what new archetypes are going to come, and I'm going to save talking about that once we actually have the Bloomburrow cards, and, it's a little bit less of just pure theory craft once we start to see, like, what has been performing well and what hasn't been performing well. So we'll save that for August. But I hope this gives you a good idea of kind of how the best of 3 scene is going to change and what to do for your favorite archetype. And hopefully your favorite archetype wasn't on the list that I said won't survive rotation. Of course, Azorius Control is going to be around in some fashion. I just mean the current version, when I say it won't survive rotation, is that like I don't have a good answer for Memory Deluge. So it's not like it's going to go away entirely. It's just not going to be a tier 1 archetype until somebody can figure out how to replace that card. So some of this you may or may not agree with entirely about like my substitutions and such, and that's fine. I was just really trying to help out with those who are maybe going through their first rotation and don't know what to expect, don't know how things are going to shift. That being said, I do think that you should probably, if you are new to Magic and going through your first rotation, hold off on crafting for a little bit, just because it's possible that I have all of this wrong, right? It's possible that we're going to get cards in Bloomburrow that are going to make Simic Cookies and not a tier 1 archetype, right? So this is my best speculation, and hope it helps. So take care, everybody. Have a wonderful week, and I will catch you all. Probably the next video will be outside of my draft videos for MH3. Will be the standard showcase. Whatever wins the vote here on the community tab on YouTube, I'll be showcasing on Saturday. So take care, everybody.